Hello everyone, today we talk about the Persian Wars, making a naval overview of the same, given that we're expanding on naval warfare in Schwerpunkt's content, and I think that a broader approach to the, say, political and strategic background, but also the part of the operational um, side of the story, especially concerning the Navy of these wars is very useful for the content that eventually we'll make. Today, for example, we will cover the naval battles of Lade and especially Salamis. So you understand that these will require a video on their own each. Recently, I made a video about the Battle of the Argunusai Islands that more or less follows the pattern of what I already started for the land battles, but this was the first naval battle I covered in that detail at least, and it essentially by method shows how I will operate for the others as well. And naturally, you know that here and there we talk about the Persian Wars and especially, well, both Hellenic classical warfare and Achaemenid warfare, about which I have multiple playlists, depending on also what branch, let's say, of the armed forces we're looking at. In fact, including properly the naval side, but also within the land forces, whether we're talking about infantry or cavalry and so on, chariots, etc. So I simply go with this today without focusing too much in the details, but reflecting a bit on the broader outlook with a naval bias. Now, as you know, the context is the westward expansion of the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BC. The empire was new, was fresh, right? Was lively, strong, and this is also what makes the wars in Greece so interesting, because from that side too, as you know, there was a civilization rising. That also, in this aspect, is relatively overlooked. At least it's important to stress it, how much these two cultures were overlapping together with many others, right? Of course, from a Western perspective, our idea is, once upon a time there were the Greeks, as we know them, and as we have stereotyped them in the Enlightenment, also celebrating their modernity as opposed to their tradition, while it was actually a pretty intense struggle that is deeply, in fact, intertwined with the one also between the Greeks themselves and the Achaemenid Empire, and some Eastern Oriental barbarian horde decided to take over, right? Western civilization as it was already crystallized, and the invaders having nothing to do, of course, with any form of Western tradition whatsoever, except, if there were literal Aryans, the actual people called like this among the two contenders. This was, an Achaemenid vassal, essentially, and not from the Hellenic side. Not that the Greeks, as we have explained in our history of religions, did not actually own some of the most radically hardcore, brutal Indo-European imperial universal ideology that perhaps was second just to the Veda in the hardcoreness of it. I mean, at least in line of principle. I made multiple videos about this, but let's say more than else, pretending to distinguish the something like a universal empire, like the Achaemenid one, had affirmed itself as something that Hellenic civilization that literally straddled the Aegean Sea, and so fell also in some of the most active and dynamic centers. Think about Miletus, that was with Thales, the real, say, birthplace by approximation of Western thought, Hellenic philosophy. In fact, within the Achaemenid Empire, and probably quite stimulated by it at the same time. Of course, this doesn't mean that there were no differences, or that Hellenic thought already didn't have quite exclusive peculiarities on its own. But at the same time, we're looking at a world that still conceived this universal unity as a given reality, and therefore the sole possibility of challenging it came from the ambition, the aspiration of becoming the next universal power. And this doesn't have to be, in fact, strictly rationalized or to be found expressed openly in a given source. There are here and there, of course, in the quite rich Hellenic historiography of this very time, so, where we consider our own Western history and historiography to have been actually born. But it's crucial, again, to understand the background of this all, where these peoples were coming from, and where did their conflict originate in this sense. The Achaemenids, by expanding in Asia Minor, had brought under control the Hellenic polis of the coast of Asia Minor, right? And it's exactly the place where Achaemenid rule was mostly resented, probably, at least more qualitatively so. Not so much because the Achaemenid rule was oppressive in and itself. Actually, as we know, Persian rule was relatively mild, and it also was bringing the same stability that made the same empire flourish from the within, but also in the same provinces, these ones that enjoyed anyway an important degree of decentralization, and that were thriving as major political, cultural, economic centers. Right, as we've seen, philosophy was being developed here, and this contrast, this location, even just between, again, the much older, also Near Eastern civilizations, this essentially Scythian dynasty that the Achaemenids were, that as the Scythians had been doing from millennia, raiding periodically the Middle East and eventually managing to create this empire in this struggle between the steppe culture and the sedentary world. In fact, the Scythians, very close to the same Greece and the same empires. The Achaemenids would invade Scythia at a point, and also were to retreat, importantly without too many gains. The same Balkan hinterland, as a matter of fact, right, that considered itself in great part at least a client. Right, a Persian would have said a subject in that sense, but this doesn't change the practice of the same Achaemenid Empire. In other words, most of the Hellenic world couldn't but conceive itself, even considering the prestige that it had by itself, as outside of the greatest empire in the world that they knew. So in the universe. In a way or another, so comparticipating to it, which was a very specific religious principle. The idea that owning a power within the boundaries of the same great empire meant to share part of its divinity in a way. And in fact, the reason for resentment towards the Achaemenids derived from the Persian support to local Hellenic, say, dictatorships or tyrannies of tyrants, by the way, that when expelled by the polis, those that had kind of a more egalitarian balance within themselves, took refuge at the Achaemenid court, right, and could be used to essentially, in fact, make leverage within the same polis. The Hellenic polis, as you know, had been born fundamentally through on one side, a process continuity with the older Mycenaean age. There was not really a true Hellenic Middle Ages or crumbling of civilization, especially as far as the centers were concerned, and in this sense of the same sense of Hellenicness, right? From a cultural point of view, that in fact is so defined, so stratified historically, and in this sense also so conservative, which is a bit the difference also that existed with the Romans, right? The Hellenic exclusivity as opposed to the Roman, for example, more barbarian inclusivity, but also discontinuity as far as the ancient kind of monarchic rule, or in some cases properly aristocratic, at least by a certain degree, had been countered by a more egalitarian estate of landowners, of sometimes also medium landowners that had their force in the infantries, in this kind of still, in fact, historically tribal and so traditional fashion that had begun to challenge the monarchic state per se, and had made of it kind of the pride of this culture and this individual liberty that is embodied by the same Hellenic phalanx, by essentially the scarce presence even of any form of cavalry at this point in Hellenic warfare. Probably has been also exaggerated, as you know, but that definitely represented those forces that had also put an end to the Bronze Age princely chariot warfare and consequently politics and society. But of course, through the expansion of the cities, a higher stratification and a greater hierarchy was trying to reacquire the important control, and especially supported, as we've seen, by the Achaemenids, that naturally needed to concentrate power, especially in the periphery, in order to cope the local elites and controlling better these otherwise much more autonomous centers by vocation in that regard, and that were in fact also threatening the same Achaemenid hegemony in the area as far as for example, the commercial, also demographic in a certain sense penetration really was, and so this was as you know, the dawn of what we consider properly classical Hellenic civilization at its apex, that the same Persian Wars fundamentally embody, also in the same Hellenic epos, historiographically, essentially demonstrating the moral and thus cultural superiority of the Greeks over the Persians. Naturally, things were a bit more complex than this, also because of objectively the Achaemenids were more advanced than the Greeks. Also, from a strictly military point of view, it's self-evident, even during the same defeats of the Persian Wars. But of course, keeping things together, also from a broader reality, and at such great distances from the centers of power, and against an enemy that is much more pervasive and qualitative. There is no doubt about this too, right? That in a one-to-one, consider the hoplite versus an average Achaemenid warrior, albeit from a collective point of view, from a also training point of view, discipline, etc. Of course, the Achaemenid armies were capable of things that the Greeks could just but dream, right? Even things like the fast advance at Marathon against the Achaemenid army was just, without breaking ranks, was nothing short of a miracle, right? But it also shows of course the important moral loads that the Greeks themselves had. And thus, such Achaemenid interference in the Hellenic world was deeply resented, also in different ways, because again, the colonies of Asia Minor were much more directly involved in this, right? Hellas proper was, considering things in a different way. We was interested, as we will see now, with the Athenian participation to the Sardes expedition. But they wouldn't be woken up until the Achaemenid invasion, and that was the heart properly of the Hellenic civilization, as you know, so much so that when you talk about classical Greece, also in terms of what we think of the standard phalanx and of course political organization, we were essentially talking about Athens and Sparta, right? Already the surrounding was looked upon by the same polis with kind of suspicion and kind of attitude of this kind of, they're not real Greeks, at least not as much as we are. And we will describe that also in a historical, religious sense, maybe in another video. But the awareness also about this reality is quite important. You know that Herodotus was even accused by the same classical Hellenic classical historiographies of having been a philo-barbarian in a way, because he came from a mindset that was deeply aware, in fact, of that Hellenic existence within an Achaemenid reality, and Herodotus accounts have been continuously reconfirmed by the most updated historiography, and thus we should, of course, take in consideration what was also the not necessarily the fabrication, but let's say the perspective of other Hellenes within the broader the broader world of the Greeks. Now, the origins of the Persian Wars lie thus in the revolt of the Hellenic cities of the Ionian coast, so the middle part of the Aegean coast of Asia Minor. They were the most thriving, the most developed. In 491 BC, famously enough, they rose in revolt and expelled their tyrants. Right, so some kind of aristocratic, oligarchic, if not monarchic at some point, figures that were evidently bound to the Achaemenid establishment, rule, and obedience in general. The Ionians formed thus a league which directed the war, seeking allies from the cities of, let's say, more independent Hellas. In 498, the Ionian League, with the assistance from Athens and Eretria in Euboea, 20 and 5 ships respectively. There are not really a few in those times, right? Sometimes you look at this time and say, well, even the same Salamis compared, I don't know, to the battles between the Romans and the Carthaginians, just like a fisherman brawl, right? But we're talking about 500 BC, right? It's an incredibly archaic time. In order just to bring at sea 20 ships, as we will see later, Athens will bring 10 times more in this context, but it was enormous, right? And it meant, as you know, this is also partly the underlying issue, politically speaking, that these forces were manned by sailors, which represented a bit the force of kind of the middle classes or the lower classes, as a matter of fact, that were countering that kind of aristocratic, tyrannic rule that could have, in fact, taken further root in Greece had the Achaemenids won the wars, coming dramatically close to in the process, by the way. So they were literally the tip of the balance, and that's why they were so important, and that's why also what we call is, at least Hellenic democracy, in a way we have come to describe, also positively for some reason, started from this important force that was naturally vehiculated also by very, in fact, enterprising and bold and fresh new leaders, such as Themistocles. There are many others. Generally speaking, all these admirals that fought against the Achaemenid, the Achaemenid navy were, as we will see at the very end, extremely arrogant in a sense, right? They were claiming, of course, to be the true saviors individually of their own city, and there was a fierce competition between themselves, and this also, in fact, exposing the problems of the same system. So you can have a system that is superior even though still having issues within it. Consider that Greece would be taken over, as a matter of fact, by, at the end of the day, by non-democratic powers. Look at Macedonians, look at the Romans, and so on. And also democracy, naturally, in the 5th century BC has a very different meaning from the one that we intend today. And the Ionian League and their allies sent thus the expeditionary force inland in Asia Minor, which burned Sardis. This was, as you know, one of the most important cities in Asia Minor. Was the seat of the cult of Kubala, that was Kubalus. That was a Dionysian figure that, however, was deeply connected also with a nobiliar model of some sort. So it kind of embodied, in a way, that sense of barbarity that the Achaemenids had in part tolerated within their own empire included, whereas the Greeks had a dramatically, at least Apollonian bias, even though, again, the tectonic forces were necessaries for them, including the sailors, the humus, and of their society. So there is that kind of ideology in between. And the naval dimension of the Ionian revolt is deeply important, because even though the most important score was the destruction of Sardis, we don't know whether it was conquered, at least the lower city. Then a fire broke out. We don't know whether it was wanted or not, but the city was destroyed. But there were other ships from the allies that spread the revolt as far as Cyprus, that was divided between Asians and Greeks. By the way, so it was a frontier land that, as you know, was crucial for trade, because it connected the Levant with the Aegean. The Phoenicians still had an important role in international trade, and in fact, as you know, also the Achaemenid navy in great part was Phoenician, Egyptian, so also of other peoples, other cultures that were the old sailors, and while the Greeks were the new force emerging in Mediterranean and much more prominently at that point. So it was like the attack to a broader system, right? A system that was huge, because literally the empire, as you know, stretched from the Aegean, from the Balkans, literally to India, and in perspective, the Greeks were some just random frontier barbarians, perhaps a bit less primitive than, say, the Scythians and so on, but not necessarily more ideologically reassuring, considering what their deal of, their cry for total freedom really was. So against also the liberty of tradition, and this was terrifying in some way. And again, within the Hellenic world, there was a huge conflict, as you know, between these ideas, and of course, however, the ultimate goal was proving their own collective superiority over the universal power as well, in which they truly believed. And this is an aspect that must never be underestimated. The Greeks were convinced of their own superiority, just like the Romans were, just like the Germans were. And this, morally speaking, makes an awful lot of difference, aside from sheer luck, for which every one of the greatest conquerors and winners in history owe part of the entire thing. But in fact, fortune favors the bold. I made a video, if you're interested, on Caesar's religion. That was perhaps the greatest expression of this in the history of mankind, traditionally speaking. So the Ionian fleet operated by supporting the Hellenic cities of Cyprus, when a large Achaemenid army and fleet invaded the island to recapture it entirely. Right, so the Persians didn't sit there and watch, and on the contrary, reaffirmed their control in such important base of power of trade. As you know from the many videos we've made on naval warfare throughout all the ancient and medieval times, and even beyond, fleets were used essentially as support for land armies, right? So they were hardly important for themselves, right? We're not in the Victorian era in which you literally have the naval technology to block entire stretches of sea. You can intercept anyone or almost. Here, the point of spending, by the way, the atrocious amount of resources that a fleet required at the time, especially for the upkeeping costs, but as we've seen also from the Atlantic side, for the political and social meaning that manning them and maintaining them that this really had, was to support land armies, right? The reason inherent in the same naval strategy of these campaigns is to allow the land armies to progress on, in fact, most of these coastal areas, and needed unavoidably for the logistics, for supplies, and maintaining the armies also in enemy territory and facing an enemy fighting at home well efficient and loaded. So this move naturally already showed that the Achaemenids were not taking such a front lightly. On the contrary, especially Sardes was a problem, because there was all an ideological symbolism attached to the city and the Achaemenid rule of Asia Minor to it. The principal city of Cyprus was Salamis, not the one of Salamis of the battle in Greece, and the opposing fleets and armies, right, of the Ionians and allies and of the Achaemenids met near that city. The Ionian fleet on that occasion defeated the Phoenician squadron, which was supporting the Achaemenid army. But the latter, aided by the treachery in the same Hellenic forces of the island, which was a common feature of these wars, defeated the Cypriot forces that, in fact, were fighting them, and the Ionians, thus, in fact, deprived of a land force that to support, could do nothing more but returning home and awaiting, naturally, from the wrath of the King of Kings to abate itself on their home, which would have required naval forces from the Achaemenids as well. And so the Ionian fleet was deeply important for the survival of the same local cause, right? Naturally, the Cypriot example shows essentially a proxy war for which the Ionians didn't have full control of Cypriot forces and politics in general, and that's also, as we've seen, how the Achaemenids prevailed. You can notice that already the Hellenic naval superiority is showed, right, against the Phoenicians, which is a huge deal because those are the best sailors of the Achaemenid Empire, and so it prefigures very interesting dynamics. Now, by 494, the Persians were pressing back into Ionia herself by both land and sea, because they had essentially to take over coastal centers, so they could have never make it if they hadn't blockaded the single polis from city and land. And naturally, the target was Miletus, so the same hub of the Ionian revolt, the cornerstone of the League herself. So the last chance of survival for the Ionians was their fleet, right? Because a victory at sea could essentially allow their cities to keep being supplied, and to resist, in fact, from the land siege of the Achaemenids that would have been dramatically worn out. Consider the distance, right? There is all the passage of Mardonius later on with sources showing how the elements themselves would dramatically weigh on the Achaemenid logistics on such far, distance from Mesopotamia, from the Iranian plateau, and so on. It was a great cost. But it also shows how important, again, the Hellenic valleys were for the Achaemenid Empire. Had the Persians given ground to the Greeks, these would have fundamentally kept expanding unchecked and infiltrated the same empire. This is eventually what literally happened from Xenophon to Alexander through the various stages of Hellenic history and civilization, but still with the final destruction of the Achaemenid Empire after an important Hellenic infiltration, also for good as a support, but still a reshaped empire that had fundamentally given up the mystique of its own universality. This is why the Persian Wars are so crucial, because, and this is the essential point, it's a psychological one, the Achaemenid Empire was undefeated. It was literally conquering the entire globe. And so there was nothing else beyond that, and this was, of course, thought to be the embodiment of the absolute divine. So even just standing against it meant taking very important, kind of even metaphysical steps. Are you a hero to achieve that? To achieve what the Persians have succeeded in already? Right? This is the enormity of the Hellenic civilization at the time. Having the guts of doing this and even succeeding in the enterprise. Right? And this is extraordinary, except nobody knew what the outcome would have been until it happened. And that's the point with wars and politics in general. So, the Ionian League fleet was concentrated at this point at the island of Lade, that is in fact near Miletus, and was threatened by the Achaemenid fleet of 600 ships, which is a lot. Consider that the one of Xerxes, as we will see, will be essentially 1,000, 1,200. There is debate about this. I made a video about the order of battle of Xerxes' army. I think we didn't talk about the fleet, so we will do it at some other point. But as you know, the numbers are dramatically inflated by the Greeks, and we mostly guess on the base of kind of logistical reality rather than else. Still, it was a huge effort, as we were saying before. 600 ships by the early 5th century is just what literally a world empire can put at sea. Now, the bulk of the Ionian fleet was provided by Miletus herself, and by the inhabitants, however, of also other 3 big islands of the same Ionian coast. There are Samos, Lesbos, and Chios, that all participated a bit the destiny of Miletus in that sense. There were a number of smaller contingents, however, ranging down to the 3 ships provided by Meus and the 3 by the polis of Phocaia. And these, again, would have all been absorbed by the Achaemenids, so much so that, as you know, they also provided with galleys for the Achaemenid fleet during the invasion of Greece later on. In this contingent, it was the commander of the Phocaian contingent. Phocaia being a very important naval entrepreneuring polis. It had colonies up to Italy and so on. So these were men who knew their business at sea. And in fact, their commander was by far the most talented one, Dionysius, who attempted to bring some efficiency to the allied fleet as a whole. So trying to confer some kind of greater collective discipline and quality to the entire naval force. In fact, for a few days, he was able to have the entire fleet exercised, beginning to train them in maneuvers like the one of the Ekplus, that essentially consists in breaking through the enemy ships' lines by ramming through the openings, breaking the rows, etc., and then bypassing, in fact, the enemy line and wheeling about and falling on the enemy rear or flank. And this maneuver naturally was probably known to all the Greeks already. It's just that carrying it out required a dramatic training, a very high quality, and it was naturally better done collectively as opposed to individually, right? When we will talk about naval tactics, we have already seen it at the Battle of the Argunuzai Island. We described the Ekplus, for that matter, and that's the Peloponnesian Wars. It's already a more advanced stage. At this point, you see that this Ionians at least had still to conform themselves altogether to this updated tactics, but it's these battles are very similar to the land ones, right? The same Salamis definitely looks like even the Battle of Cape Artemisium, a bit to the same Thermopylae that were being fought on land. There was a higher quality of the Greek ships, also because the fight was carried out in melee, right? Not just by the ships, but literally through boarding, right? Never commit the ignorant mistake of thinking that boarding began, I don't know, when the Romans invented the corvus or something like that. That was the standard naval practice since the dawn of maritime warfare. And the Greeks were heavier; they had better marines. The Achaemenid fleets were actually even more maneuverable altogether. They could carry out, just like land forces, more complex maneuvers than the Greeks could ever coordinate. They had a much better idea, probably, of combined arms as opposed to the Hellenic armies that were just heavy infantry, literally. So they had just one arm, even. But there was also a lot of individualism, which we have somewhat forgotten for the Greeks too, because we think they were just thickly packed in the phalanx, nobody moved, but that this is not a historical thing. There were single guys that literally launched themselves straight at the enemy and smashed into their lines, and then hopefully others would follow, or etc. And you find this happening even with the galleys on these occasions. Very often these, as it happens on land, the units, the lines faced each other, they exitated, and then one said, okay, let's break this, and launch themselves against the enemy. Maybe they were taken out immediately, or they could actually instead open a gap in the enemy formation. So this was a real deal, real matter. As you know, even at the opening at the Battle of Salamis, there are various, the most complete account is Herodotus' one, there are others, but in that one you see that these guys had visions, properly female deities saying, what the hell are you even waiting for? Just charge, right? This military logical concepts that are being expressed even by a religious authority, which is exactly what by the divine, because that's exactly what in the concept of universal struggle at the end of the day you have to do. You have to be aggressive, right? You have to maintain the offensive. You have to keep on fighting and struggling and pushing and breaking and subjugating, and this is the core of the thing. So the Ekplus was, as you understand, a bold maneuver, because not just you had to break through the enemy lines, but you had to charge for it, right? So it required great effort. The crews can perform only some of these maneuvers at a time, because otherwise they're exhausted. And they had to keep on the rhythm because they have to wheel, maintaining the momentum to fall back again on the enemy. So it's an extremely complex maneuver, and it does require a lot of training, a lot of exercise that these Hellenic polis do not invest already in, because they, even just properly naval warfare at that point had not been that frequent. There was not much of a need. As we see, also the Athenians, if it had not been for Themistocles convincing them in the council that it was necessary, obviously, to have a fleet to counter the Achaemenid one, would have not even levied one, and would have been disastrous, strategically speaking. So everything is done with great effort, right? In civilization, it's all about really breaking through an incredible resistance of idleness, of weakness, at the end of the day, of human nature. So much so that the example of Dionysus that trains this Ionian colleagues is disastrous, because it went on for 8 days, after which the other commanders mutinied, said, "We don't." Well, this was the commander-in-chief, by the way. The other contingent said, "Our sailors are exhausted. We don't want to do this anymore." And they would pay for this, probably, because now what the Battle of Lade was really about. Consider that also this idea of the league entailed, just like in other circumstances, we've seen it for the Germanic peoples, etc., that these were, again, mentally speaking, Indo-European freemen. Right? So the idea of having a leader was, for strictly military emergential purpose, was normal, because they understood the basic military principle of unity of command. They couldn't, they had to obey a single authority, but they didn't like that so much. Right? It's just like the feudal nobility against kings. Like, they considered these just like primi inter pares because of their necessities, but they didn't like to even obey each other. And this is not so good when, of course, you are, like in this case, multiple polities acting independently and realizing the need of cooperating, but not really wanted the leaders of this, of that city to take over, because they may be profiting from that. They may not give back, at least, or they may acquire too much power personally that could shift the balance later on during peace, if earned. So that, as it often happens, we've seen it for Cyprus as well, there's also a lot of self-sabotaging, because some prefer just to be under the Achaemenids as opposed to support this entire thing. So, of course, you can imagine there were split opinions regarding this, even within the Admiralty. The same sailors. It's just like today. What are you, Democratic or Republican? All these things. Like, it's the same thing. And as a consequence of this refusal to carry on the naval training, to follow Dionysus, the Ionian fleet spent their time idling on the island of Lade, and so missing an opportunity to perform better collectively. There was also on this occasion treachery in the Hellenic ranks. When the Achaemenids fleet came, the Ionians set out to engage. Although not nearly well enough trained for it, their vessels were in the formation for the Diekplos of line astern. And this probably means columns of about 10 ships. It was a large battle. It follows a bit the same pattern that we'll see also later. The Achaemenids were more, and they could essentially outflank the Hellenic fleet. So the latter would choose some kind of geographical barrier, some island, the Gulf, Cape, whatever, that could prevent the Achaemenid maneuvers. In fact, we know nothing for the Battle of Lade relatively to the Achaemenid naval formation. However, their superiority in numbers will have allowed them a considerable overlap, particularly on the seaward wing, which was their left one, the Hellenic right. And in albeit the Persians were able to dispose of 600 ships, they may have had considerable difficulty in getting them all into action or formed up, right? Particularly if they were not using a column formation like the Greeks were. That makes things easier because you just have to follow who is in the front. And this is exactly the same principle of the phalanx in many ways. it gives greater push and simplicity, albeit things at sea work a little differently from, masses of men on the battlefield. In fact, the Achaemenids were the favored ones in this, and as we will see, not even the Hellenic individual superiority, of course, was able, in the absence of any particular tactical feat of the Achaemenids, to prevail. The plan itself shows a bit what happened in the Battle of Lade. The Samians that were on the Ionian right, so were probably the ones who would have been greatly outflanked by the superiority of Achaemenids in Galleys, did not engage. Right? They broke for home before even the battle started. So it tells you immediately that Samos was just we don't like this situation, either because we don't hate the Persians too much, or because we are going to be butchered. Our allies confined us on the right, probably because also we're kind of the weaker ones of the league, and so we don't want to die for them, and we flee. Except for 11 ships of theirs that probably said no, because they probably believed in the cause, or they feared repercussions or whatever, and they stayed and fought. In fact, the Lesbians next to the Samians fled when their flank was uncovered in turn. So this was also pretty standard. It's the same concept of the phalanx, right? Once it's outflanked, it's done. It collapses even without being engaged yet. And part of the Hellenic left wing also fled at this stage, because at that point the entire formation was starting to lose considerable amount of pieces. The center was made up by the Chians. These stayed and fought hard, right? These were the ones for which most resistance was to be expected, in a sense, and both taking and inflicting heavy casualties. The Chians were also equipped for a boarding battle proper, because they had 40 marines per trireme. And as we've seen, the Hellenic hoplites were better marines than the Persians. They were heavier than them, and so at close range they were advantaged. Not that it was an easy task to essentially ram and board, because that's how it happened, right? That there weren't. We don't know much about boarding in that situation, but as we see, these ships were very close to each other. They almost interlocked. In fact, even when they attacked, they ram each other. They remained stuck with the enemy ones, and so at that point they would also board the ships. And the objective was to essentially replicate a land battlefield on the decks. And this is how it would remain, by the way, until the early modern age. I mean, the Battle of Lepanto was fought practically in the same way, even though there were firearms already and so on. And that ramming came back in the late 19th century, because the ship's hulls were becoming thick enough to render also artillery at that time was quite advanced, kind of undecisive in some contexts. So this is a bit of a sinusoidal trend that does happen also in naval warfare, as just in sea in land warfare. You see cavalry, infantry going up and down respectively over the millennia. We don't have any evidence of the Achaemenid left wing managing or attempting even to surround the Ionian center, right? So it may have been that they had set off in pursuit of the Lesbians and Samians. These survivors of the Chian contingent were able to withdraw to Chios, in fact, and their cripples got across the bay to the north shore at Mycale. In absolute terms, the best Greeks at Lade were the Phocanians under Dionysus. Right, his 3 ships were probably the best trained, the most experienced in the entire fleet, and in fact, a gap opened in the Achaemenid line. Opposite to them, when the Achaemenid left, set off probably in pursuit of the Hellenic right. And Dionysus was therefore able to break through, right, and to take 3 enemy ships in the process, apparently without losing even one of his own. In any case, as you understand, the Battle of Lade was a Ionian defeat. It was clear that for the League, the day and the coast were lost altogether on that water, and this was an important Achaemenid success. Dionysus, talking about the character and understanding what kind of experience, generally speaking, he had, what kind of options in this Hellenic world existed for entrepreneurial buccaneers, let's say, did not return home in the Phocaea, but he instead set out for the Phoenician coast, knowing that at that point was devoid of warships, because those were still fighting, in fact, the Achaemenids in Ionia. So he bailed out entirely of the coast. He profited dramatically from it because he engaged in very remunerative commerce raids, piracy, with his fleet of 6 ships in the Levant, and eventually he moved to Sicily, where he became essentially a corsair as well. So this tells you already the dynamism and the the potential that, in fact, the Hellenic world had from a maritime point of view, and how much it was already, in fact, exploiting, how many individuals could put this experience at the service of a military cause. In that sense, the Ionians didn't. Dionysus was not the average. So the Ionians failed to recognize it. They refused to train. He was probably convinced of the cause, but he realized, okay, we lost. You didn't want to listen to me. I'm done with this, and he simply went away, right, far away, and pursuing this maritime lifestyle, in another context. Consider that if the Persians, as we will see now, had conquered Greece, probably even up to the kind of the Magna Graecia would have been conquered, right? So the entire arrangement that various tyrants could make, even with foreign power, non-Hellenic powers, was considerable in that regard. So literally, there was room for a lot of ambiguity in a world where the sea was that extended to make it a frontier for so many powers at a time. The Battle of Lade ended the Ionian revolt, right, apart from mopping it up. The Achaemenids turned next, however, so that they were taking control of Ionia, against those who had supported the rebellion across the Aegean, right? And also in the burning of Sardis, Athens had sent a contingent also of hoplites, right? When you read, I don't know, as we did before, Athens had sent 20 galleys, Eretria 5. But there was, in fact, a naval infantry contingent was also, as we've seen also for the Romans, like we talk about marines, but they're actual legionnaires. They were the same infantry forces, right? So Athenian hoplites had participated to the sack of Sardis. And I think so the Eretrians, I don't remember whether we know that specifically or not, but you understand, they were there. And they were surely hoplites from somewhere else. They were also mercenaries and so on. And it's obvious that the interference in the Asian affairs had to be punished in a broader universal sense. As we were saying before, for the King of Kings, what was Hellas was just, again, a a remote peninsula among some barbarians in the west that had interfered against the same imperial rule by supporting a revolt that led to the destruction also of the main center in the region. So that was quite of an affront to Achaemenid rule altogether. It could not pass unpunished. Plus, there were, today we will not discuss it, but there were lots of reasons why the Achaemenids would have liked to occupy Greece and benefiting enormously from that commercial potential that the region had. And ideally, the Achaemenids would have liked to arrive up to the Atlantic, right? Ideally, not that they could do it, but in practice, taking over the Aegean meant in great ways to extend their naval power, in fact, as much as the Greeks were doing, but from like so many polis at the time, so not as a unique power, but as a culture, right? And thus creating a sort of maritime lordship on the Mediterranean. That at this point, the Achaemenids, aside from, as we've seen, the naval potential they had, but they could not extend to control the entire sea, especially as the Greeks were in between. In 492 BC, the Achaemenid Mardonius conquered Thrace and Macedon, who was the royal family. He secured the land route to Hellas in the process. Thrace and Macedon essentially were, subjugated to many problems, and as we will see, they would remain even during the following invasion of Greece. In 490, a fleet of 600 triremes, so we've seen the same size of the Achaemenid one used to crush to the Ionian revolt, plus horse transports added to it, because they needed specific ships for transporting animals, and this we see throughout all naval warfare in this time. Transported, in fact, a Persian army across the Aegean. I made a video about the strategic history of the campaign of Marathon. So if you're interested, it's one of my very early videos. Perhaps I will re-upload it because I obscured the picture, you know why. So you can see that in much greater detail. So today we will not deal with it entirely, but let's see it from a from an overlooking perspective. After subduing various islands, the Achaemenids took first Eretria, right, and then landed in Attica at Marathon, threatening Athens, and threatening specifically to topple the local regime, to install their own Greek of trust, right, to make Athens a loyal vassal of the Achaemenids. The campaign was designed properly as a punishment against the responsible of the interference, and this is interesting because objectively these were important cities, well, especially Athens, and so this was a bit the symbol of the entire story, like striking a remarkable success against a city like Athens meant that at large Hellas could be conquered, also to match many problems. And objectively, what was at stake during the 490 campaign was exactly this, right? And that's why the intro premise is important, because again, the Hellenic polis were at large thinking to live within the Achaemenid Empire. At least they knew that the Persian deterrent was enough to keep them at bay and serviceable and paying subsidies, being obedient. I mean, the same Achaemenids, after all, benefited from the Hellenic trade, right, through their tyrannies and so on, as we've seen. So if Athens had been defeated, well, the Greeks probably would have had a completely different mindset. The tyranny party would have taken over and we would know a very different world today, even without the dramatic victory of 10 years later. But the marathon in itself, as you know, was just a pretty astonishing feat of the Athenians and the Hellenic model at large, per se. As you know, at the marathon, in fact, the Athenians defeated the Achaemenids, which probably didn't count like an enormous force, but it was a big deal also for Athens at the time. People say maybe there were 25,000. In my opinion, there were not even 20,000. There were something like 50,000 Persians. In any case, it was a dramatic force. As you know from the accounts, the Greeks feared, especially the Persian firepower, for which they had to make the phalanx advance speedily, risking to break its unity. Instead, they succeeded because they were driven. Probably they were also lucky because the Achaemenid cavalry was not present, at least in force, on the battlefield, because it was probably ravaging around. We know also from the size of the bay, the fact there was a swamp there, etc., what more or less the maximum size of the Achaemenid army really was. And we know, of course, of this also code word that the Greek explorers used by saying, look, the horses are not here. And probably that literally means that the Persians had gone foraging, because logistic needs are not just wishful thinking. And as you know, there was this dramatic victory in which the Athenian phalanx, that was heavier, more compact, came in hand-to-hand fighting against the Achaemenids, managed to break them. And while the Persians were retreating to their ships, the phalanx, however, lost cohesion. So most of the Athenian casualties were suffered after the Achaemenids were already broken, and they engaged kind of hand-to-hand fighting, which naturally the average Achaemenid warrior was kind of superior individually to the Hellenic one, at least. They were probably equal or something, because the hoplite, and especially in a polis like Athens, was not properly trained to fight with a sword in a professional sense, right? The only ones that did that were the Spartans, that are the usual exception that confirms the rule. For the rest, as you know, the political model of the Hellenes, we have made several videos about Hellenic warfare, was essentially an amatorial one, right? Full time military training was what barbarians did, and the Hellenes were too superior because they were too smart and too rational to do that. So discipline was everything, even though, again, collectively speaking, this wasn't much of the thing. Most of this fitness was made up by the general political cohesion, the fact that these people knew each other. The world was relatively small for them, very different from what would happen after the Athenian thalassocracy started, and during the Peloponnesian Wars and so on. So this was, however, a clamorous success of Athens, to say the least, and because they showed the entire Hellas that the Achaemenids could be defeated on land. And this was a huge deal, because aside from the naval superiority that at least at Lade had been affirmed, well, as we've seen, the ships were just an instrument for land armies. So the Greeks showed that they could win in conditions of numerical inferiority over this formidable military machine that the Achaemenid army really was. Still never made a video about Achaemenid tactics or the art of war, but that was a pretty damn impressive thing for the times, and again, superior to the Hellenic one. Now, 10 years went by. The Persians were distracted by a revolt in Egypt, which was quite a big deal, among other factors. So the next useful times, as you know, was in 480. And it was obvious, however, throughout the entire decade that the Hellenes had just woken up, right, for the worst, and entirely the Achaemenid giant, right? That defeat was much more burning, the one of Marathon, than the just the wound that had been inflicted with Sardes, and it was in fact a challenge against the entire Achaemenid Empire. I mean, if the Achaemenids were so radically obsessed with the Indo-European mentality of this, of course, a divine nature of power, for which, if you win, you win always. If you're really a hero and you can afford to rule the world and transfigure divinely, and you cannot be defeated. If somebody defeats you, it's because you're morally inferior, and thus this will essentially encourage all these subjects to even claim, like, why are we still under somebody that can be defeated? Naturally, the political balance was much more concretely based, but this is exactly the point. I mean, the same revolt in Egypt, as it would happen also later on after the same defeat of Xerxes, was obviously a consequence also of the Hellenic failure of the Achaemenids. But still, we have to give that the empire maintained an extraordinary solidity and capacity of repression, right? That just the Greeks could challenge concretely at that point. The bulk of the empire remained, and even these important provinces such as Egypt and so on, intact. And actually, they would serve for they would serve for an invasion after, the second invasion of Greece, after having already rebelled on some occasions. Also made videos, as you know, about the various contingents in the Achaemenid army and so on. So we will observe them in detail. I think I made one specifically dedicated to the Nubian contingents. Oh, that's interesting. In any case, towards the end of this period, towards the end of the 80s, that the Achaemenids were ready for making a major effort to conquer the Hellenic mainland, and a number of states in northern and central Hellas were prepared to submit to Persia. And for once, the Greeks combined their forces, which they'd never done. They had never been feeling called into cause, right? As we've seen, the Athenians had this issue with the empire, and probably also the Marathon campaign was resented by other Greeks that said, look at these fools that, for their kind of imperial ambitions, they kind of called war into our homes. And at this point, however, the threat was enough to realize that it wasn't just about Athens. It was like the Achaemenid interest was in taking over the entire land. Naturally, Marathon had also greatly exalted, as it happens, like who wins gets it all, right? And so, politically speaking, that was also a major victory internally to the same polis against the tyrannic regimes and so on. So, in this 10 years, Greece was growing fast, by the way. So there was no time to lose also from the Persian side. And everybody knew of this race. And the Greeks chose, naturally, the Spartans as the leaders of their coalition. Sparta was already the foremost military power and prepared to resist. Just some weeks ago, I made a video about Spartan drill and training. We'll talk about Spartan warfare more. I just made something about Hellenistic times, but so far from these ones. But okay, I talked also about Pylos and Sphacteria. Yeah, we will get, however, more into it over time, hopefully. And so, the entire Greece was to resist this major onslaught. So, famously enough, this epic, historically speaking, the Achaemenid army, massed by the king of kings, Xerxes, consisted of an enormous amount of troops. Some say up to even 100,000 as a possible number, properly of fighting troops, not just the, including the field days and so on. This once contained the 10,000 immortals that were the king's guard, and so embodying the moral, cultural, racial, divine, imperial superiority of, again, the world empire entirely. They were the emblem of that unvulnerability, and that was the point of the immortals, right? The idea that they were always of the same, the core was always of the same number, because whoever died was replaced, and these were, by the way, the elite of the same empire. So there were this divine face that would never be, that could not be crushed, and so the entire ideology of the empire, also its insignia, its symbol, was brought to Greece, properly to stress that if the King of Kings wanted, it could just march into whichever land in the world. So this was heavy, right? Because it was meant also properly to eradicate any further Hellenic resistance. And again, the Achaemenids went dramatically close in succeeding. So that's why the Persian Wars in general are so radically relevant for any person in the world, because the world depended on, and the world as we know it depended on it in many ways. The Achaemenid fleet is said to have had over 1,000 warships, which is a bit exaggerated, as the others that we have listed today in general. There are various calculations. These are some of the most hotly debated topics. Again, we will see them better in detail in other videos. But it's fair to say that the Achaemenid navy mustered essentially the forces of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, plus an enormous amount of supply ships. Right, and supply ships can go out there only if there is somebody guarding them, and so you think all the cargo, the supplies, the food, the fodder for the horses, they were importantly in number. That's, as we've seen also at the Battle of Marathon, probably also the vulnerability of the Achaemenid army that had needed to leave to forage, because such a force needed it, not just the horses, but ever more so. As we've seen, there were ships properly designed for horse transportation. This huge mastodontic force set off from Sardes, also quite ideologically, but because it was exactly the most important center, and so logistically the most convenient location for properly having the base of operations, which invading Greece. And as we've seen, this was far west, the entire empire already. And famously enough, Xerxes crossed the Dardanelles by pontoon bridges provided by the fleet, which also showed the dramatic level of development of the Achaemenid military engineering. To avoid the ships having to round the dangerous Athos Peninsula, where, by the way, Persian fleet had been wrecked 10 years before, a canal was dug across the base of the peninsula, which confirmed further the fact that literally the King of Kings could mold water and earth at his own will. There were enormous risks involved. Just the example of the Athos mountain is quite meaningful, right? The entire naval operations were through cabotage along the coast, so the risk of the weather changing and shipwrecking against the rocks and so on was pretty consistent. And as we will see, the events would verify in this regard, but probably by divine will, as the Greeks wanted. And the Greeks originally intended to defend northern Greece, which was definitely not much of a good idea, retrospectively, because it would have been just an enormous strain for themselves as well. as we've seen, northern Greece was not loyal. They preferred just the Persians marching in. So actually, even the same geographical complexity of the south was to play importantly in favor of the locals, because these were basically the Athenians and the Spartans, plus again other cities, but those were the ones that literally led the struggle, as you know. But in the event, the land forces were, as you know, placed in the pass at the Thermopylae, and the fleet held the entrance to the channel between Euboea, that, as you know, is this pretty long island that runs in parallel to the Attica Peninsula, and the mainland at Artemisium, Cape Artemisium. The strategy of the campaign was really simple, right? Especially with such a huge army. As I often say, there is not much that you can do in practice. You just have to steamroll everything along the way, but everything has to be simple, compact, and direct. So both sides were aware that at close quarters, the Hellenic hoplites and ships were superior to the Achaemenids, right? This had been seen, because even if at Lada the Achaemenids had won, they were more, and probably they weren't able to carry out the same stunts that some, as we've seen, Dionysus and our better trained admirals could carry out. Again, the point is that naval warfare was still kind of a hand-to-hand fighting after the kind of the approaching maneuvering, skirmishes, and so on. When boarding happened, the hoplites in hand-to-hand fighting were kind of superior to the average Persian warrior, as it was showed in Marathon, when the hoplitic phalanx managed to miraculously close the gaps with the enemy without losing cohesion and too many forces under enemy fire. For this reason, the Achaemenids counted importantly on their numerical superiority that you cannot discard, and that in many ways was concentrated, in fact, with victorious outcome. Even at the Thermopylae, that again were instrumental to the broader strategic purpose, but fit, also in a broader sense, because the Spartans didn't actually, and the allies didn't really go there to be exterminated. This is, an actual spoiler. The Hellenic aim was to hold a narrow position where their flanks were secure. This had been shown at sea and would be repeatedly shown also at the Thermopylae and so on, because again, in open field, the Persian army was better, right? They carried out more complex maneuvers, they had a higher collective training. So again, as we've seen very often, if you need to just defend into narrow passes and so on, it's because you don't have that strategic superiority that you think you have. So the thing was to make the Persians give up, naturally, by striking also a significant strategic victory, multiple ones as a matter of fact, and the naming this was crucial, because if you took that out, you could hope to essentially just oblige them to the Persians to retreat, as it would happen. And the Persians, on the other hand, were to find a way around to enable their numbers to be brought to bear. So in a sense, this complicated their maneuvering, because they had locally greater difficulty. Every loss had an important cost for morale, for politically, because think all the subjects, again, even some former rebels that had been brought to fight, and so on. So this was a very important, a supreme test, and you realize how dramatically morally loaded the Persians really were. The problem is that also aside from the strictly military point of view, nature doesn't help, because as you see, Greece is all that composite with lots of gulfs, straits, islands, a terrifying interland. So it's extremely complicated to bring such huge numbers and using them having the chance of using them effectively in that space. But geopolitics does not exist, so of course it was not the geography that won the day, it was the Greeks that won the day, as in any war. In any case, as we were saying before, the example of the Thermopylae is significant, because after 3 days, a traitor showed the Achaemenids the way around the Hellenic position. And the fleet at Artemisium, they equally sought to outflank. Immediately on arrival, a force of 200 ships was sent to sail round Euboea to attack the Greeks from the rear. Now, the Battle of Artemisium, actually these 3 days that, as you know, of fighting, that we will analyze in detail in another occasion, but it's dramatically fascinating, because it was sort of ballet, trying to balance the situation there exactly along that kind of quality position versus number and maneuverability. And the Hellenic fleet consisted of 271 triremes plus a few obsolete pentacounters, so that they had just one row of oars, but everything would make, right? We can imagine also from the Achaemenid side that not everything was literally up to date, but sometimes just mass is important, as long as it's balanced with the cost of it logistically, you know. The Hellenic fleet was made up largely by Athenians, 127 ships. The years following Marathon, the Athenians had in fact diverted the increasing revenue of the Laurium silver mines to the building of a fleet, because they had already kind of understood the potential of it, aside even from the Persian threat, but just to extend their political power on the Hellenic world. It was mostly a coastal one, right? All these cities were largely on the sea. Then there were 40 Corinthian ships, 20 from Megara, 20 from Chalcis, but supplied by Athens still, at least, however, manned by the same Chalcis, and 64 from 9 other city-states. The Achaemenids had, as we've seen, over 1,000 less the flanking force, but the Greeks were forced to send 53 Athenian ships to the narrowest part of the Euripus, strait between Euboea and the mainland, to hold off the flank force, because otherwise it would have been bottled there and trapped. And although the Spartans only provided 10 ships, their admiral, Eurybiades, was at the command of the whole fleet, because even though, as we've seen, Athens had was almost making up a half of the entire Hellenic fleet, none of the other poleis would serve under an Athenian admiral at sea. And the reason being that, of course, Athens was scaring everyone in Greece because of her naval power. Famously enough, Themistocles actually was seeking for the engagement because for strategic reasons that entailed also, saving all the Athenian refugees that had fled, as you know, from when the Achaemenids would march on Athens and so on, but also because, he knew in perspective that, of course, that was the only way to save Athens, and that's the victory would have also exalted the naval contribution of the polis. And in part also because the Spartans had a greater name, and they had, as we've seen, just quite modest naval power, to say the least, were considered kind of more morally superior in a sense. Let's consider Athens was literally conquered by the Persians, so at that point, kind of they owed very much, in fact, to same Hellenic decision there that still didn't miss the opportunity of profiting from each other's disasters, even under this greater threat to everyone, really. The Greeks had a stroke of good fortune, as we were saying before the Achaemenids moved into the strait, because a storm arose which not only drove many Achaemenid ships ashore, but also destroyed the flank force sailing around Euboea. This meant a lot, because probably the entire Hellenic fleet would have been trapped hadn't this happened. So this spirited enormously the religious world at this time, because they thought the gods of the sea were with them. There was a broader ideology there, for which, as we've seen, the Achaemenid one was the celestial power par excellence, right? And also the Greeks had the sense of them, but let's say that sided more with tyranny, right? Because siding with the masses of the rowers, of these lesser people, was to side with the masses of the Chthonic forces that the Dorian conquerors had gloriously vanquished and commanded. The same Spartans, as we've seen, embodied a bit more that kind of religious idea of sacral kingship, that made their military superiority in a qualitative sense, because they literally were a very narrow elite of warriors ruling and abusing systematically much larger masses of slaves that would have reflected the original subjugation of the Indo-Europeans, of the Pelasgic forces of that war. So again, this emphasis on the raw mass, on the humus of society, on the rowers, on the oarers, on the even in part on the same hoplites, what they represented in an anti-tyrannic sense, was seen by some, say, aristocratic Greeks as, they didn't like it that much, as just what we were saying before about Napoleon and the French Revolution and so on. But the point is that also in tradition you cannot really win, solarly speaking, Apollonianly speaking, if you don't coerce the Chthonic forces. Because if you can't command them, you can't really command anything, so you need them also to give you this raw, brutal, titanic force in the masses, aside from the hero ruling and leading. This had all consequences in the Hellenic world, because after the victory in the Persian Wars, as you know, there was this sort of moral debauchery that represented by democracy that everybody criticized. Think about Plato and so on, and so that things reverted after a few centuries back to aristocracy. But it was at the same time the consequence of the peak reached during the Persian Wars, in terms of that balance between the aristoi and the people, the commoners, even though, again, that there was no such difference conceptually, because everybody was free brutally at the time. I mean, in the sense that you're free just because you can have slaves, because you are still part of the original tribe, right? Even if you are not much of a warrior anymore. And this was the entire point also, as we've seen, of the Hellenic war. It didn't consider even the military exercise as so useful for maintaining that perfection that the Greeks thought to have created as a broader political and social model that was anti-aristocratic in Carthage, let's say. So this shipwreck of the Persian forces was saving like a way out for the Hellenic fleet. The odds were also further evened, because simply the Achaemenid fleet was less numerous, up to 1/5. In fact, it seems that well over 200 Achaemenid vessels were shipwrecked, without mentioning that the Athenians could stop guarding the Euripus with their 53 ships that were sent to join again the main force. So this also, tactically speaking, was a very important very important factor. The Persians were not only more numerous, however, they had better trained crews, right? Which means, again, the Greeks had the better marines, but the Persians had the better sailors. And thus the advantage in maneuver laid in favor of Xerxes. The Greeks had to negate that to their enemy. So there's the Battle of Cape Artemisium, lasted 3 days. On the first one, the Greeks tried a Naval formation, which basically presented no open flank because it was just like a bit of a bent tail, right? It did not permit a deck plus because it also was kind of deep, right? It entailed that, couldn't quite break through a thinner line. They formed essentially up in a large circle, prows outwards, and without internal room for maneuvering. In the first, so the Persians advanced, and they were very cautious and careful, as much as the Greeks. So nobody dared to make the first move, and there was a contained engagement after all. The Persians lost 30 ships in the first day of fighting, and gained no advantage in practice. So it's a bit like at the Thermopylae. The phalanx frontally could hardly be broken. The second day was quiet, with the Achaemenids at Phatae apparently awaiting a result, either from the land engagement or from their flanking force. Because, by the way, the Thermopylae were being fought exactly at this point. So everybody was waiting for the news, because if the Thermopylae fell, naturally the Achaemenid army could swarm into Attica, and the entire strategy, also navally speaking, had to change, as it would happen. And during the course of the 53 Athenians reached the main force from the Euripus. So at this point, the Achaemenids really felt that their outflanking capability was lost, because now definitely they had tried for a day to try to outflank the enemy. They hadn't made it. They had even lost ships in the process. And they were a heterogeneous fleet, by the way. Consider this, that some forces had also attacked autonomously because they were provoked. They tried to break through. So everything was also about the action of the single admirals. And now this other 53 Athenian galleys just told them, look, if you didn't make it before, it's even harder now to make it. So on the third day, the fleets clashed again. Neither side had a decisive advantage. So the Greeks couldn't move forward because they would have lost their advantage, their cohesion, against a superior and more mobile enemy. But the important thing there was, just like at the Thermopylae, that the Hellenic fleet continued to hold up the Persians. That was also psychologically very impacting, because literally the Persians had moved this gigantic force over land and water by drawing resources from all the known world, and then arriving to these, again, bunch of barbarians in a remote peninsula. A small, what apparently just dimensionally just a small business was just stopping them, and so they were starting to see in the enemy that same empire manifesting, the same ones that they claimed for themselves, and that was deeply alive, right? Aside from any kind of democratic or republican or whatever you think mythology has been created on the Greeks, that was the entire point of the Persian Wars. And we should see things definitely in less modern and secular ways in order to appreciate history in the first place. So at the end of this engagement, considered that at least 100 Atlantic ships had suffered some damage because the Achaemenids had tried to break through, right? So, but more than that number, the Persians had suffered. So, at the end of the third day, news came to the fleet that the Spartans at Thermopylae had been overrun, and there was no further bar to the Persian army advancing into Greece herself. So, as we've seen, as important as fleets could be, the Achaemenid army was entering their homes, and it was the most important threat. So the Hellenic fleet withdrew. There was the Athenians to say. In fact, the Hellenic land forces held and were building a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, which, as you know from geography, meant that everything east of that was lost, including Thebes, which in fact submitted to the Achaemenids, and more importantly Athens. So, as we've seen, the numerical bulk of the Hellenic fleet, and also a quite important, the most important Hellenic city, as a matter of fact, and the forces of which were essentially evacuated and trying to rally also to keep on the struggle in the west of Greece. So most of the population of Athens was famously ferried to Salamis, Aegina, and Troezen, while the Hellenic fleet was based itself at Salamis following the retreat from Artemisium. So the area was naturally the one where at least the fleet was to resist. The Persian fleet had also advanced and was based on the open beach at Phaleron, that is just in front of Athens, and on the adjacent beaches and harbors. It was huge, by the way, so consider, well, at that point, the logistical side of the story, because Athens herself had been taken. The Persians destroyed the older citadel, avenging the destruction of Sardes ideologically. So, I don't know if you ever visited Athens, but if you when you stand on the Acropolis, you kind of feel that. You realize that, oh my God, east of this the Persians came, and this is where Xerxes stood at some point. That's frightening if you consider properly the geography of it all, considering Asia from one side, Europe from the other. It's fantastic, right? And the situation was pretty grim. The defeat of the Thermopylae was, of course, conceived to hold the Achaemenids as much as possible to put up some better resistance, but now that dam had been broken and the Achaemenids were swarming into Greece, and they had to be stopped because there was no other place to run. The rest of the country had been subjugated. Nobody could do anything but you, basically, and so it was really the time to test who was worth of the gods and out of ruling. The Persians, from their side, were reluctant to enter the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland. The same goes for, going on up to the isthmus, across the isthmus of Corinth for the same reasons on land. But the destruction of the Hellenic fleet would have meant definitely also the impossibility of the Peloponnese to resist on its own on the longer run, as we've seen. The problem is that Athens' fleet and population and so broader force was still intact. The Spartans, yes, were formidable hosts, but without naval forces, they couldn't do anything themselves. So it was really much about the about the naval side of the story now for the Greeks, and equally for the Achaemenids that had dramatically stretched their supply lines in the process. Doesn't matter how rich Greece could be. In many ways, their cost was enormous just to keep that enormous amount of forces on such a faraway land. So after Artemisium, especially, the Achaemenids thought importantly of the Hellenic naval capacities and considered that now the Hellenic fleet had brought up to 380 ships. So compared to, it was basically half of the Achaemenid one at that point. Also with reserves which had been mustering at Pogon, at the port of Troezen. So the naval forces there were meaning more than ever, because again, crushing the Achaemenid fleet would have essentially meant the end of the expedition. And it's fair to say that Xerxes' fleet was the Schwerpunkt of the Achaemenid army at that point, because not even the land forces posed such a threat like the naval ones now. As we were hinting at before, the Athenians were having dramatic political problems. Their leverage on the coalition had dramatically sunk, considering they had lost their own city, so they dramatically depended on their own allies. And it was very difficult to convince them that remaining at Salamis to defend basically the Athenian refugees that had taken shelter in the island and the surrounding ones were worth defending. And coming to such an engagement so soon, so early, especially given that the Achaemenids were again wary of the Hellenic capacities. So the Athenians had to do something for themselves. The Peloponnesians were pressing hard for a retreat to the isthmus to join the army, and thus leaving the Athenian refugees just to their destiny, and taking out such an inconvenient ally definitely out of the game, except for the fleet that would have remained intact. So at this point, consider the Achaemenid perspective as well, because in spite of the difficulties, the uncertainties, that an attack, the risk in general that an attack on the Hellenic fleet would represent, still the logistical pressure was enormous. They had to do something. They couldn't simply sit there and essentially wear themselves out before engaging the enemy, especially giving time to the enemy to increase its own forces. And they cared especially for preventing the Hellenic fleet escaping from Salamis. In fact, if the fleet had fled back to the isthmus, it would have been stronger, right? Also closer to the army. It would have somewhat had greater operational usefulness for the enemy. So it was important to block possibly the same Hellenic fleet there and preventing it even to supply easily or to be joined by reinforcements. And that's when Herodotus tells us that the Athenian commander Themistocles passed a message secretly to Xerxes, informing him that the Greeks were planning a withdrawal. That was true, by the way, because the Persians were surely aware through the turncoats, the spies, and so on, that there was this dramatic clash among the Greeks themselves, and they wanted to believe that ever more. So the head of the most important contingent of the Hellenic fleet was telling them that was the case, and this allegedly, according to Herodotus, induced the Achaemenids to get their fleet to sea to block the exits to the east and west of Salamis. At this point, Themistocles had won his move, because um, the fight was inevitable. The Greeks had to force the situation, and they couldn't just let their own only instrument of possible salvation, that is their fleet, being destroyed. So this is particularly important because it shows also how confident the Achaemenids still were after all, and how that pressured the same Peloponnesian to say, well, this is really a formidable enemy. Is it worth taking Athens out completely of the game? Just imagine, from a Spartan perspective, later on, how much those times would have been, thought of. Now, the Achaemenid initial dispositions at Salamis is facing the western exit. You had the Egyptian squadron. Originally it was 200 strong, but now perhaps it had fallen to 150. The eastern exit of the bay were the remainder of the fleet, of which the core was now the Phoenician and Ionian squadrons. Interestingly enough, naturally there were Greeks in the Achaemenid army, as you understand. The Phoenicians had originally provided the Achaemenids with 200 ships, the Ionians with 100. So they were all a bit less than this. Plus, the Achaemenids put a garrison on the island of Psyttaleia to gain possession of any damaged vessels that were beached there in the course of the battle. Which is also interesting because it tells you how desperate the Achaemenids were, realizing that probably their quantity wouldn't beat the Hellenic quality. And to oppose the Egyptian squadron and hold the western exit, the Hellenes placed the Corinthians, probably with other vessels, maybe 80 ships in total, while the remainder of the Hellenic fleet was at the eastern exit, where the battle was to be decided, at least hopefully. The Achaemenid fleet was essentially deployed to meet an expected Hellenic breakout, right? The enemies were trapped, and so they would try to either lure. In fact, this is the point. We don't know so much about the battle in itself. That's why we need an entire video, right? So how it really went. There are so many different episodes, so we can reconstruct certain things. But it is this: the Greeks had either to attract the enemy in a trap, or to break through, or doing the two things at the same time. And strategically, they had definitely to break through, and so to come to grips with the enemy. But tactically speaking, as we've seen, the best was to attract the enemy in close waters. And in fact, this is exactly what they did. The Greeks enticed the enemy into these more confined waters of the Strait of Salamis, where their inferiority numbers would be less critical. In other words, a bit like at the Thermopylae, again, like at Cape Artemisium, like at Lade. Closing distances and narrowing fronts so that the numerical inferiority would play less, right? And the enemy could not outflank the force. The fleet therefore left its anchorage on the north side of the Kusonura Peninsula and set off eastwards before turning south and forming line facing the Persians. And the Achaemenids advanced to engage. The Hellenes backed water into the narrows of the strait, and so the trap was successfully set, right? Remember that also this idea of advancing and showing the courage of it, and the ability of maintaining formation at the same time, is a dramatic part of the psychology of the entire engagement as well. So it's not just about, here the Greeks wanted the Persians to do what they wanted, and the Persians do it because they were dumb. No, because there was properly a moral balance that floats around that. It's not just the material side of the story with the position where the battle will be fought, right? And everything can, escalate in a direction or another quite quickly, for completely unforeseen factors. So it's just a huge gamble, like war is in general. And the other advantage that the Greeks managed probably to get through this maneuver was to split the Achaemenid formation to pass around the Psyttaleia island that was in between. It's a bit like what we have seen in the video of the Battle of the Argunusai island. In other words, those that were inferior in numbers could, let's say, enlarge their front by including an island between them. And this also, of course, taking away the ships that would have been in between to reinforce their flanks and/or the depth of their formation, and to split the enemy forces. So, for example, by retreating further to carry out a sort of ambush, like getting past the island, you would have some squadrons that would attack the enemy on the flank. Right, so this is not really different from land battles when you think about it. There are different logics. Like, as we were saying before, ships cannot quite push themselves the same way men do on a battlefield. The same reason why infantry charges and even cavalry charges are different, and our horses can do the same. So it's another thing, but this was very cleverly fought, and consider it was a huge engagement, by the way. So everything is made much more uncontrollable, albeit this is the point, like it's resolved through this brutal mass fighting where eventually the ships would just interlock with themselves, and it's just the best fighter that makes it. And that would advantage the Greeks, because as we've seen in boarding, they were kind of more advantaged, and this was just a big muscle to muscle iron arm and face to face, rather than any kind of more broadly complicated maneuver. Naturally, the entire naval warfare, as you understand at the time, was kind of more or less the same, because one side would always fight next to the coast. I mean, all the fleets were next to the coast, so somebody would have had to exploit the just this advantage literally of terrain, because that's emerged earth that makes it. And again, reducing the Battle of Salamis to so few is probably shameful, but we also have to look at it hopefully in greater detail in other videos. So the engagement in itself is very picturesque. You can read Herodotus, Aeschylus. There are many other also later accounts that follow others that existed at the time that were lost. We can't reconstruct the actual wall in detail, but there are some episodes that are worth being considered, again, in an appropriate space. The engagement lasted a number of hours, but at the end of the day, the Hellenic fleet was victorious, despite the hard fight put up by the Persians, that, by the way, were looked upon by Xerxes, that had installed, as you know, his throne to watch the battle from a height overlooking the strait. Needless to say, Xerxes was furious of this engagement that meant, literally in front of his eyes, the collapse of the entire expedition, and this gigantic campaign that nobody had ever even thought to enact. So this was also the heyday of glory of the Hellenic navies in general, properly in the epos, and opening another branch of history, another river of history that flowed impetuously for the history of the world and the preeminence of Western civilization. In this clash, there are various interpretations, by the way, of how this battle was fought exactly, where all the ships were deployed. I just invite you to search on Google map of the Battle of Salamis and seeing, essentially how many different types of disposition historians came to propose, right? Because literally we don't know. So at some point, I will also propose my own, and naturally the best one has already been proposed. So I'll probably just follow that on the base of the arguments that will convince me about it. But don't think that we know that greater specificity all in all, right? This is unknown to anybody who has read the sources, and you have just to go with them and really reading them for what they are historically, rather than thinking that it's just knowing where this or that squadron was located. It's not so important, right, as opposed to the entire concept and the moral forces of it all, especially, that really make the difference more than anything else overall. The Corinthians had been in action at the other exit against the Egyptians, had prevented that force specifically from carrying out the outflanking movement that was so much feared, similarly to what we have seen for Artemisium, and that was apparently not carried out at Lade. And the Corinthians were chosen specifically with that task, and they performed it very well. Despite a number of these vivid incidents, visions, anecdotes, episodes that single ships really did, naturally it's the mass that counts. Herodotus talks, obviously, about that at length. The actual course of the battle remains somewhat foggy. Literally, some authors said the Hellenic fleet faced north, and said, no, they faced south, no, they faced east. They couldn't face west because there was the land from the other side. It's just the only certainty, unless something changed geographically during the battle, which is quite unlikely, at least if you don't believe in divine transfiguration and such things, but they did, so who knows. In any case, the battle has a logic just like this. If the Achaemenids took position in waters favorable to them to prevent an expected Hellenic breakout, and were enticed in the past Psyttaleia, in the narrow waters of the strait, which would essentially split them in two and narrow their front, which is, however, also, why would they do it if they knew it? Well, because, again, the reason was not the land. Again, geopolitics does not exist. The reason is the moral forces, the humans that have them. And so, probably they thought that they had a superiority, and they were so morally driven to gamble this entirely from a strategical point of view. They could be, so they had to vent that also tactically. So, it's not so strange after all. The strait at Salamis is considered, it's like this, like there is the Kynosura Peninsula, then there is the island of Psyttaleia. There's another little island kind of in between, and then on the other side of land you have also where Xerxes was watching the battle from. So the geography of it is quite important. The strait is something like 2 kilometers wide, and we are told that the Greeks were in 3 lines. So this would have made something like, 6 or 7 meters between the ships of the oar blades of the adjacent ship, which is very close, by the way, assuming something like 300 Hellenic ships in total. For this reason, the Achaemenid fleet would have been even more congested. Considering they had an island in between, likely, and thus they could not use their numbers effectively. It's possible that forces were also distributed in different parts of this geographical reality, and so there were different engagements in different parts of the strait. But this, it doesn't eliminate the broader problem of concentration and mass and maneuverability that all played a factor here. In any case, we know how it ended, and the Greeks won. They won everything because they the Persian fleet retired to Asia Minor. Xerxes retreated as well, leaving a land army in northern Greece. So you know how it ended on that front. In 479, this land army was defeated by the Greek forces combined at the Battle of Plataea. And so at that point, the same year actually, the Greek fleet crossed the Aegean and destroyed the remains of the Persian fleet at its winter base at Mycale. So basically Xerxes bailed out because everything was lost. And by the way, the empire was starting to revolt as a consequence. So think about the sheer amount. You could even calculate this. I mean, the characters were very well aware of the cost of this all. They were knowing, and of course much better than us. For that matter, this is also one of the single most studied campaigns, not just from a strategic point of view, but also from a logistical one, because it was just a massive feat of the Persians that, just say, wow, like how could they even make it? It was amazing. This also shows to you how much logistics has, telling the truth, yeah, it's very important in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it has nothing to do, per se, with being decisive. And it's not even part of strategy, by theory, right? So wars are fought by fighting, not by, we're won by logistics, right? It's not that, right? And also logistics is never kind of separated in its level of development from the broader effectiveness of the entire army for other reasons: training, discipline, order, armament, etc. They are all intertwined, but for this reason, not one per se is decisive. And you can't really tell what is going to combine the entire difference. Again, it's always like the tip of the iceberg. Like during World War I, the war was not fought this stripe from Switzerland to the North Sea on the Western Front that didn't move but a few tens of kilometers throughout the years of the war because there were machine guns. That happened because there was Germany from one side, France from the other, entire countries, industrial powers, Britain, all the other countries that made that balance happening. That didn't repeat itself historically because it had nothing to do with machine guns. It had to do with politics, not with what the single soldier does on the field, and not even with shelling or anything, right? So in the East they fought in a different way. In Asia they fought in a different way. In Africa they fought in a different way, and more, right? So it's and the point being there that thing can be the tip of the balance if you don't consider that this is resting on a massive amount of things that are also as much as dynamic and that are obviously altogether decisive compared to the tip, but you just want to see the tip. This is not correct politically, strategically, morally, and much more, because it means basically you don't get anything about how to balance things in a war and how much things go wrong for everyone all the time. And of course they shouldn't, and the better one makes things go better, but not necessarily winning in the process, right? So it's full of wars where everybody won all wars, but then all battles, but then the war was lost in a sense, and it's purely random. Like there is no school to it. It's just an example of what may happen. What happens in every single war is a completely different thing. And the only way to predict it is to radically study it in ultra detail as much as you can, which is an incredibly difficult thing. Not making weird comparisons that really do not mean anything, if not for the sake of didactical teaching, but not ontological, like to define what the reality of it. So, from a naval point of view, given that this is the bias of the video, well, you understand that of course, in a war fought across the Aegean, the employment of these fleets was of enormous weight, and it was especially because also of the nature of the politics that were using them. The Persians were using subject fleets at large, including Hellenic ones. So yes, there were Greek hoplites that fought from both sides at Salamis, as well as in any other of these engagements. From the Hellenic side, this meant really the entire balance of their political order. Just for the Achaemenids as well, because as we've seen, the subjects paid a price to that. They wanted to be reimbursed in a sense, and so they started rebellings here and there as well, and causing problems to the empire that, however, remained standing and importantly so also, in front of the Greeks as a military power. The Achaemenids, famously enough, kept interfering in Hellenic policy. The Spartans at some point fought for them, so nothing again is so diametrically divided. Like there are the Persians here, the Greeks there. That Xenophon could write a Cyropaedia, and a Persian arguably could have not written an Hellenic political work, right? So this speaks volumes in itself, beyond also the beautiful ones that we have about Hellenic historiography regarding these events that were naturally regarded as the foundation of Hellenic of this phase of Hellenic glory specifically. And so it was another age entirely. Again, the preeminence of the sailors, of the admirals, of the forces that could put these fleets on water really meant a lot of those who financed them. I made a video last year which was a comparison between today's U.S. naval costs and the ones of Athens back in the classical era. And they are strikingly similar in terms of resources properly spent, considering the naval power of these giants for their times historically, respectively. So, what else to say? Again, I'm embarrassed to just make such a short video about such a huge topic, because we will have to make many others. But I think adding piece by piece, mutton by mutton, will create the building at the end of the day. The broader consequence, at least on the immediate, was the Hellenic reconquest of the Ionian Islands, and even of mainland cities that existed in Asia Minor as in Greece in the few next years on the right bank of the Aegean. This meant naturally a dramatic preeminence of Hellas over also the Ionian world and in Asia Minor, because those had been defeated, while Athens, specifically also the rising naval power in the region, had won properly and protagonistically the battle against the Persians. So obviously the Ionians were to be taken over by that broader Hellenic mainland, still maintaining autonomies. Of course, powers didn't have the coercive capacity of today, but still for those times was huge, and Athenian thalassocracy was really a big deal. The Peloponnesian War was fought on the base of this, and it simply enlarged properly the horizons of the same Greeks that were to fight eventually abroad in ways that they had never done, and that would change the same world. It was always change. It was never like a fixed moment which you can't say. This was the purely crystallized classical reality of Greece. There was never such a thing, not even for the phalanx, not even for... And study every battle and you will see something different. And this is in fact absolutely normal. So it's important to get habituated to the complexity, the graduality, yes, but also the diversity of properly of directions that the systems took for all the reasons that you understand. But also understanding how intertwined they were at the same time, right? So categorization is kind of advice, an encyclopedistic advice that we got through the Enlightenment, that for all the other things that did well, surely is not particularly appreciated for this one, that has ruined our way of thinking. But in a sense, the Enlightenment is also a bit child of ancient Greece, because this idea of creating categories out of things that were thought to be individual and unique was born there. Was not born at Salamis, was born before. It was born actually in Ionia. But you see, the idea of, for example, looking at a tree and saying, that is that tree, and it has, I don't know, magic powers, it's been created for this purpose. And instead starting to wonder, but wait a second, is there a way to say that is a tree? And is there some characteristics that I can use to categorize, say what I think look like old trees at the end of the day? And it's an important philosophical and scientific achievement of Hellenic reason, let's say, that we still use. A Persian would have thought, no, there is no such thing, because there is one tree, and that is, say, it is that tree that is not like other trees, right? It's properly a thing on its own. And the same Hellenic mindset, and this is what we tend to overlook, was coming from the same idea, the same thought. Like, nobody had invented it yet, as at least kind of as a broader philosophy that could also be propagated and developed further. The world, generally speaking, reasoned like the Persians, right? I don't know, the Greeks reasoned this own way, but say the Romans or the Celts, they still kind of reasoned like the Persian at that time. So that tells you, even to this day, the magnitude of the Hellenic philosophical scientific impact on our thought. And be aware that that's a historical product, of course. It's not just the standard reality. It's just a way to see it, reality. And if you can master it, better. But if you can master it and be aware that it's not the only thing that exists, nobody will stop you. And I think, in a sense, this is the secret of the same Hellenic success. In many ways, it probably was in different proportions and measures and dynamics, the same success of many other peoples, including maybe the same Achaemenids, and the idea of knowledge as the foundation of reality as well, for better and for worse, is crucial, right? And then this was definitely already a modern and secular way of thinking, and so that's why also the Hellenic world at some point declines, and also keeps entrenched within itself. It's a bit the same mentality, we said it very often, that you find in the Byzantine world. Like, the idea, whatever is our own thing is perfect, the rest does not exist, and in any case it's not better, even if it did, right? So this is how you get conquered by the Romans. This is how you get conquered by the Crusaders, and it's not a good idea. And the best of the Hellenic thought was in the moment in which it was not, in fact, as many other thoughts, telling the truth, was not sclerotized, was not crystallized, was open, was also, in fact, gravid of other intuitions, etc., and context. That's the same with Herodotus, that in a sense was still a bit too barbarian for the tastes of, I don't know, Thucydides or. But being barbarian in that sense is not even that bad as you may think. And in fact, it does turn out that there are ways and ways of seeing things that derive, in a sense, even from this sense of accomplishment that the Greeks still had. Right? They were reconfirming their own idea that they were the best. And so that unavoidably, in human nature, relaxes you to the point of cognitive dissonance. And it's very dangerous. But there will be ways to analyze this aspect. For example, again, the Hellenic and Roman mindset were very different, deeply different things, and that also shaped the Western world as much as Greece. So it's definitely worth considering. But the naval culture, right? This idea that in Greece, objectively, there is no place in the Aegean where you can't see a land from. There is always either the coast or another island and yet another island, and this stimulates intelligence, stimulates curiosity, entrepreneurship, the sense of adventure, expansion. This surely was very important. Also blessed by the weather, by the fertility, again the proximity of the universal empire within which you really are, and so you're habituated to think like. It's important to consider that Hellenic historiography was written largely after these events, because before those, you would have surely found much more, like in Herodotus, much more proximity to the before. So also in a way that probably from a mental point of view had, in spite of the achievements that existed also in this author, definitely in that unique Hellenic way, also there was something that probably was lost later. And there is an anecdote that shows you, in this sense, the seed of destruction and of greed and of how you have to reach power, then you have to be able to maintain it, which is exactly what the Achaemenids were realizing when they lost to the Greeks. That yes, they had conquered the world, but now they were starting to fall themselves. And it is this episode that follows the victory at Salamis, where the Hellenic admirals met to vote, literally choosing the one of them that who had done the most for the cause of freedom in the war, Hellenic freedom. And you know how it ended? Probably some of you know the episode. Well, when the votes were counted, it was found that every admiral had voted for himself. And that is kind of eloquent, because it shows, yes, that individual view, but still the lack of that sense of truth at the end of the day, which the universal superiority revolves around, and that thus was probably needed to compact, to push forward in a way that could have also prevented the final decline of this old. But definitely were many other glorious years for Hellenic civilization to blossom further. I made a video, by the way, that is the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization and Indo-European interpretation. It's in the Indo-European history playlist you can find, that can help perhaps a little bit clarifying this point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.